stored in Scripture. So with the constraints imposed by Scripture and a little bit of careful thinking, I think we can get closer to the answer to this question. So let's review their history, because this history then will dictate how we understand why we don't see and eat today. So first question about their history, when did they live? Evolution says 100 million years ago. Of course, you can't put 100 million years in Scripture. Now, many folks, sorry that's a little dark, it's supposed to be a cool picture of dinosaurs looking like they're about to go extinct. We know many folks are persuaded by what they think is science to reject what's the plain teaching of Scripture, to somehow manipulate and reinterpret it. And there's really no good scientific reason to do so. One of the major lines of evidence to argue for not only a billion-year-old Earth, but a very specific time in the geologic layers where the dinosaurs went extinct is this concept of radiometric dating. And if you were with us yesterday, we discussed three major problems. I want to highlight perhaps the biggest one again here this morning. And the biggest problem is this method involves a number of unproven assumptions, three major assumptions, and we'd really need to know that these assumptions are valid before we start applying them willy-nilly to the Grand Canyon and other places. So how do we know the method works? And the answer is we don't. The evolutionists think they know the method works because it gives you answers that agree with evolution. But that's not a valid, independent test. So if you test rocks for which we know the age, we saw them form, like that dome of Mount St. Helens, that gives you an age of 340,000, 2.8 million years. And yet, it's only 20 to 30 years old because we saw it form. So there's a big problem. And every rock of known age we've ever tested gives you an erroneous answer. Whether we're in California, Hawaii, Europe, Antarctica, here's what the ages of these rocks should be, and here's their ages in millions of years. So there's a big problem here. One of the assumptions of radiometric dating is that the rate of decay is constant. And in fact, virtually every argument that the evolutionists cite for an ancient universe relies on this assumption of constant change, constant processes, constant rates. And what many people don't know, and this isn't what shows up in the classrooms, is that that assumption gives you inconsistent answers. They tell you about the answers that fit evolution. They don't tell you about the answers that don't fit. So here's an example we went through yesterday. Mud flows into the ocean, erodes off the continents, lands on the ocean floor. Some of it gets subducted. Mud goes in, mud comes out. Geologists can measure the rate of these processes worldwide, and then you can calculate what's happening today, and it turns out more mud's going in than is coming out. So you can kind of dial the clock backwards and say, at what point did that process start? Mud's still accumulating, so there must have been a point at which there was less mud or perhaps even no mud on the ocean floor. So if you assume that the rates we see today, the processes we see today have been constant for as long as the ocean has been in existence, you get an age, a maximum age of 12 million years, which once again, that's not the age of the ocean. That's giving the evolutionists all the assumptions they want, and you still can't get 4.6 billion years. So this is 100 times off, 100,000 times off. That's a big problem, just one example. Now I will discuss something we didn't hit on yesterday, just briefly, and Jason Lyle, our astronomer, has much more detail if you're interested. One of the other main lines of reasoning to argue for an ancient universe, of which the Earth is an ancient part, is light from distant stars. And if you go to the BioLogos website, this is one of the arguments they'll cite, BioLogos being one of the foremost theistic evolutionary groups out there. They'll say, we can see light from stars billions of light years away. So how in the world could the universe be just 6,000 years old? And not only do we see stars, we see events far beyond a 6,000-year distance. So how do we explain that? So for the sake of argument, let's pretend this galaxy represents the entire known universe. So the edge of the universe is here, here, here. Here the universe is not a square, but the screen is a square, so we'll pretend it's a square. And some astronomical observations suggest that the Earth is somewhat near the center of the known universe. This is actually one of the research projects that's ongoing. Russ Humphreys, who was on staff with us and is now retired, did the initial observations. Well, since then, of course, the secular community has made a whole bunch more observations. We have a lot more data, and they're reanalyzing that to see if this conclusion still holds true. So for the time being, we'll say it does. Really what we're trying to say is, what we're trying to ask is, let's say we have a star way at the edge of the known universe, light's coming in. How in the world can you get that light here in 6,000 years? And what I didn't know, and what many people don't know, but what Einstein knew is that all we know about the speed of light and the speed at which it travels is a two-directional speed. And because of complicated physics that Einstein discovered, you can't actually measure the speed of light in one direction. So when someone says, how do you explain light from distant stars? The answer is, what's there to explain? Tell me what the speed of light is in one direction. Einstein himself says, you can't measure the speed in one direction. I'll just assume it's the same in all directions. And that's an assumption, not a scientific measurement. So there really is no distant starlight problem. That's the bottom line. So the main lines of argument for an ancient universe, an ancient Earth, and therefore an ancient history for dinosaurs are not based on sound scientific reasoning. There are other lines of scientific evidence consistent with the 6,000-year age for the Earth, including in the heavens. We can see comets coursing through our solar system. These are essentially dirty snowballs. As they pass around the sun, they lose some of their material. That's why they have this tail. And these guys, it's been calculated, can't last more than about 100,000 years. So the fact that we see these guys ripping through our solar system means this solar system can't be more than 100,000 years old. And actually for his PhD, Jason Lyle was studying comets. He said you could watch these guys, some of them go around the sun and never come out the other side. They just disintegrated. So essentially, the fact that we can see comets in our solar system is kind of like walking into a sauna and seeing an ice cream cone. That ice cream cone couldn't have been there very long because it's going to melt just like that. And so, compared to what the Big Bang says, the universe can't be that old. We talked about a genetic argument yesterday. If you look at the genetic differences among people in this room and people around the planet, there are far too few genetic differences for humans to have been around 180,000 years. So, we know the rate at which DNA changes each generation. So as humans reproduce, they copy their genetic material, pass it on to offspring. So my wife and I have a 1-year-old son. We have a little baby on the way. Those babies were formed when we passed on our genetic material. And that process of copying and passing it on is imperfect. Now it's really close to perfect, but it's slightly imperfect. So that after many years pass, 4,000 years pass, eventually differences show up among the human population. Now, if humans have been reproducing for 180,000 years, as evolutionists say, we should have a lot more differences. And so here's the math for it. On average, there should be about, 175 differences, maybe 124, up to 300. That's the maximum possible range. But the actual number of genetic differences is about 10, which fits very well what you'd expect if humans have been around less than 10,000 years. And then you see the same thing for other species for which we know the rate of DNA change. So here's roundworms. Evolutionists say they've been around 18 million years. 18 million years is a long time to reproduce, make mistakes, reproduce, make mistakes. And so after 18 million years, got to get the zeros right, there should be 2.5 million differences among roundworms. These poor little guys, that's an enormous amount of DNA change. After 10,000 years, very few. Less than 2,000, what do we see? Roundworms today, less than 2,000 differences. So genetics, astronomy, multiple lines of evidence consistent with what Scripture says. And what Scripture says is that God created everything, all that we see, in 6 days, about 6 to 10,000 years ago. And that range, so if you use the Masoretic text, you get 6,000 years. If you use the most generous Septuagint manuscript evidence for the Old Testament for Genesis, you might get 10,000, 12,000 years, definitely not 12 million. So when God makes everything in 6 days, He must have made dinosaurs in 6 days. So on which day were they created? Scripture doesn't use that term in Genesis, but it talks about, in Genesis chapter 1, that on day 5 God created great sea creatures and every living thing that moves with which the waters abounded, according to their kind, every winged bird according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. So everything in the sea and everything in the air would include whales, sea creatures. By the way, the fact that whales are created day 5, mammals created day 6, that contradicts the order we see in the fossil record. One of the reasons you can't put millions of years in the text is because millions of years is derived from the fossil record. The order of appearance does not match the order of appearance in Genesis. So not only does it contradict the text on the time, it contradicts the text on the order. So that means everything in the sea would include every type of dinosaur-like creature in the sea or in the air. Pterodactyls, pteranodons, plesiosaur. Technically, these guys aren't classified as dinosaurs, but we think of them as such. Dinosaurs are defined by their hips, oddly enough. Who would have thought? If you look at the hips, they have a different hip structure than other modern reptiles. Day 6, God makes the beast of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. God saw that it was good. So wild land creatures, domestic land creatures, small land creatures, large land creatures, this is all day 6. And that would include large and small dinosaurs, Stegosaurus, Tyrannosaurus, Diplodocus, you name it. So Scripture has the answer on when their existence began, 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. And the science is consistent with that. Now, some critics will immediately raise the question, well, if these guys were created in day 6, what did big meat eaters like Tyrannosaurus rex eat? Because we know the text of Scripture says that in the beginning they all ate plants. Well, here's audience participation time. What do you think this skull belongs to? Which type of creature? Hint, it's a mammal. And what do you think that creature ate? So 2 questions. Anyone want to take a stab at it? Carnivore. Why do you think it's a carnivore? Because of the sharp teeth. Because of these sharp teeth, the sharp canines. Okay. Carnivore. Now we need an identification. A guess as to what type of creature this is. It's not a dire wolf. Any guesses? Yes? A bear. Yes, it is a bear, but in fact it's a panda bear. And it just eats plants. Now, some critics have said, and actually some friends have wondered about this too. I was in Montana and some biologists came up to me and said, well, you know that the difference between carnivores and herbivores is much more than teeth. It's the whole digestive system. You know, the cow has these multiple stomachs to digest all this plant material. Carnivores have really a shortened digestive system. Well, guess what the panda has? A shortened digestive system. Now, the DNA sequence for this panda was figured out, I think, in 2010, and the evolutionary community was trying to figure out how can this guy subsist on plants? Does it have in its DNA a special equipment to digest plant material? And they didn't find it. So their hypothesis, the working hypothesis is, the way this guy can survive on just plant material has to do with the bacteria in its gut. And this topic of how the gut interacts with the body, because we have millions, billions, maybe trillions of bacteria lining our digestive system. How the microbes interact with us, how microbes interact with large creatures is one of the hottest areas of research today. Researchers are linking disease to your intestinal bacterial flora. They're linking diabetes to what you have in your intestinal system. So we may think we understand how digestion works and what's the difference between a carnivore and an herbivore, but I think research is showing we have just scratched the surface. One more example. What do you think this guy is? It's another mammal. And what do you think it eats? Any guesses?
I'm guessing plants.
That's a good guess, given what we've just covered. Yes, it eats plants. What do you think it is? Orangutan. It's not a primate. It's a small creature. It's about the size of a mouse. Good guess. But it's not a rodent. On average, it's about the size of a rodent. Yes, in the back. A rabbit. Smaller than a rabbit. It's a flying mammal. So it's a bat. It's actually a flying fox. I thought I had a picture. I don't, but it subsists. It uses those sharp teeth to scrape off the outer, I think it's a guava or some other fruit in Central America. Uses those sharp canines strictly for plant purposes. So teeth don't always tell you what a creature eats. You need to go to Scripture to find out what a creature eats. And all creatures in the beginning ate plants. Genesis 1:30, the end of that creation week. To every beast of the earth, that would include wild dinosaurs. Every bird of the air, that would include pterodactyls, pteranodons. everything that creeps on the earth in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food. So those big teeth, that's a T-Rex tooth, those big teeth don't need to be used for tearing flesh. Maybe they were used for tearing large plant things. Now this is, I think, a modern breed, but who knows what sort of plants there were in the garden. And if all we had was teeth to crack these things open, we'd probably never enjoy it. So dinosaurs ate plants in the beginning. We know the answer to that question. T-Rex doesn't need to use those teeth for what we think he did. However, when we look in the fossil record, we can see evidence of dinosaurs that have disease, and we can see teeth marks. So at some point, these dinosaurs did start eating meat. They started killing one another, and of course, the fossil record is a record of dead creatures. So at some point, they died. We don't see them today. We know death enters after the Garden of Eden. Genesis 3 talks about Adam and Eve violating the command God gave them. He told them not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They did. He kicked them out of the garden, cut off their access to the tree of life. They began dying. There's the command, Genesis chapter 2. In the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. The Hebrew is dying, you will die. So if you have a critic who says, well, they didn't die that day, and the scripture says they're supposed to die. Well, the Hebrew is dying, they will die. And that day they were kicked out of the garden, Adam began dying, just as the text says. Now there's some old earth creationists who say death is restricted to man. There was plenty of death pre-fall, and that really throws, I think, not only Romans 8 into confusion, where it talks about the curse on creation, all of creation groaning, it throws the entire structure of the Old Testament into confusion. There are some old earth creationists who are changing the definition of what's alive and what's not. Well, the Old Testament is founded on the assumption that animals are alive and that the shedding of their blood is a covering for sin, a pointer towards the shedding of Christ's blood, which is the covering for sin. And so how in the world are we supposed to understand this if there was lots of animal death and bloodshed long before Adam and Eve sinned? It really throws that into confusion. You can't have death before sin. Well, the next question, of course, is where did these big fossils come from? I think that's the Chicago Field Museum. That's, I think, Sue, and she shows evidence of disease and decay. By the way, you can find thorns and thistles in the fossil record. And Genesis 3 says explicitly, thorns and thistles do not appear until Adam and Eve sinned. So you can't have the fossil record predate the Garden of Eden. Where do these fossils come from? We covered some of this yesterday. We're used to seeing the fossil record depicted like this. Way down in the deepest layers, you see strange aquatic-type creatures. A little higher up, you see some fish, strange fish. And then eventually you begin to see land plants, land creatures like reptiles, very large insects. You go even higher up. Finally, the dinosaurs appear. They just happen to appear at this stage of history. They appear, and then at this layer right here, they disappear. You go any higher, no more dinosaur fossils. But then what you do see is lots of mammals. Now, there is a general trend in the fossil record, but really if we were to draw this in terms of proportions, this would dominate the fossil record. Why? Here's a chart I showed yesterday. There's a secular database, the paleobiology database, and I've been doing searches on that to try to get these numbers. This is the latest numbers I've gotten. It looks like 80% of those fossils in that database are aquatic creatures. And that database lists occurrences. It doesn't actually count individuals. I mean, there are fossil sites where there are estimated 1 million individuals. And paleontologists tell me, geologists tell me, that most of what you find these days are shelled creatures. And in fact, most of these aquatic creatures in the fossil record, clams, oysters, shellfish, basically, that's what shows up the most. And from bottom of the fossil record to the top, dominated by aquatic creatures. The land creatures don't really even show up until about the middle of the fossil record, and even when they show up in greater numbers, it's still the aquatic fossils that are dominating. So you think cause and effect. The effect is something aquatic, implies an aquatic cause. Not only do you find a lot of aquatic creatures, you can find soft tissue in the fossil record. And this is a real puzzle for the evolutionists. This is from a T-Rex femur. How in the world do you get pliable, elastic, soft tissue in which you can, under the microscope, see what looks like red blood cells? How does that stay in that fine, elastic shape for 65 million years? I don't think they really have an answer to this. which to me points towards a recent burial. So a recent watery catastrophe lays down the fossil record. Scripture tells us about such a catastrophe, Genesis 6-8. The global flood of Noah was not local, could not be local, despite what some old earth creationists and theistic evolutionists say. God says in Genesis 9 that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. If that's all the Scripture said, then it would fit the old earth idea. Well, the flood was universal in that it wiped out all mankind, but not global. But the text goes on to say, never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. That's his promise. And of course, we've seen many local floods since then. We've never seen a global flood. God has kept his promise. If it's local, he's broken his promise. And that's a real problem. Now, those that survived the flood went on board the ark, and that raises the question, how in the world do you get the dinosaurs on the ark? If we're going to follow the history carefully, God creates dinosaurs days 5 and 6. They begin meat eating after Adam and Eve sinned. The earth is filled with violence, chapter 6 and 8. Everything that breathes air that's on the land, Noah is commanded to take in the ark. That must include the dinosaurs. So how are you going to make them fit? Here's the text of Scripture. God says to Noah, make yourself an ark of gopher wood, of every living thing, of all flesh. So all must include the dinosaurs. You shall bring 2 of every sort. And later on in that passage talks about, or in that chapter, it talks about, uses the term kind, to keep them alive with you. So how could those dinosaurs fit? First thing to consider is the enormous size of the ark. So there it is drawn for you. There's a person, that tiny little stick right there is a person for scale. There's a whale. So 300 cubits long, 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet high. That's an enormous structure. If you do the math, it comes out to about the capacity of 522 railroad cars. So it's a huge boat. Here's a sort of if you slice it down the middle, look inside, you can see elephants there. It's an enormous structure. Okay, that's a lot of room, but dinosaurs are really big, aren't they? Anyone know what the average dinosaur size is? Want to take a guess? If you go through Chicago O'Hare Airport, you might come across a brachiosaur. That neck extends probably to the top of the ceiling here. So we're used to thinking of dinosaurs as enormous because they're cool. The really big ones are really cool. Yes? 4 feet? That's a good guess. Some dinosaurs were really small. There's a chicken. The average dinosaur size is somewhere between the size of a chicken and a pony. So 4 feet's a good guess. We're used to seeing these big behemoths, but in actuality, a lot of these fossils are not that big. Third consideration is that Noah probably did not take the big granddaddies. So, if I understand correctly, reptiles continue growing their whole life. And so those really big guys we see in the fossil record may have been those guys created on days 5 and 6 of creation that just kept growing for 1,700 years. And some of these guys are really big. There's a person for scale, and you see just how gigantic those guys are. But why take the big guys? The point of taking them on the ark is so that they could reproduce and that their lineage would continue post-flood, to keep seed alive. Seed, same word used of the promises to Abraham, to you and your seed. It's talking about offspring. So juveniles are really the ideal ones. They're young. They'll have presumably a long lifespan after the flood, a long time to reproduce and repopulate the earth. Fourth consideration is the language that's used. God says to Noah, don't bring 2 of every species, bring 2 of every kind. We discussed yesterday morning that kind is not equivalent to species, most likely. It's not even equivalent to that next level up of classification, genus. It's equivalent to probably family. So there's numerous dinosaur species, not that many dinosaur families. By the way, one of the guys on staff, we have Tim Clare, he's a geologist. He's taught on dinosaurs for many years at a secular university. He said someone went through and tried to calculate how consistent dinosaur classification was. Now, in the secular world, or in academia, the way to advance is to publish. You find something new research-wise, you publish. And so the temptation then is, every time you find a new fossil, you want to classify it as a new species. You'll get a publication. It was just another instance of the same species, who cares? So there's this trend to publish many more species probably than actually exist. And so someone went through and counted how many classifications, how many dinosaur species classifications last. So if you look at, 1980, how many species were there, and how many of those same species still exist in 2014. And I think the number is like 20%. It's something really bad. The paleontologists overclassify. So not only are there probably less species than we think exist today, there are when we look at the actual number of dinosaur families, there are far less. So you think of creatures like Triceratops, and we have other that are, I think it's Protosaurus, that has just one horn. Well, all those horned dinosaurs may be part of the same family, and all you need to do is take two on board the ark. So dinosaurs would have fit quite easily. Average size is much smaller than we're used to thinking. You're going to take the smaller versions anyways. You're going to take not that many, and it's a really big boat. Of course, everything else that didn't make the ark, because you're only taking 2, 7 if they're clean, everything else off the ark, of course, dies. And that's where their fossils come from. Okay, so the flood is not the cause of the dinosaur extinction, because some of them survived on board the ark. So what happened afterwards? Did dinosaurs and people coexist post-flood? And I think Scripture answers this question as well. Job seems to be a post-flood book. And in the latter chapters of Job, God draws Job's attention to 2 creatures that seem unlike anything we see today. Now, if you have a Bible with notes, some of these might put a little asterisk by behemoth and say, well, this is probably an elephant or a hippo. But I want you to listen to this description and see if this matches. Some might say behemoth is simply a mythological creature. That doesn't fit the text either, because in the chapter previous, what's the Lord saying? Look at this, look at this, look at this, and it's all stuff we're familiar with. Do you know, Job, where the snow comes from? Do you know how the mountain goat gives birth? And I don't know if I'm getting these examples correct, but you look at the text, it's all these things that we're familiar with, things that Job would be familiar with, and so why change the interpretation once we get to chapter 40? Furthermore, God says, look now at behemoth. He's not saying, imagine this crazy creature. He says, look, implying it's right there before his eyes, that he can see it. Look now at behemoth, which I made along with you. See now his strength is in his hips. His power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze. His ribs are like bars of iron. And that tail like a cedar doesn't fit modern creatures at all. Next time you're at the zoo, you look at the backside of an elephant or a hippo, not too long, just to look at their tail, and that doesn't look anything like a cedar tree. But you look at the fossils of the dinosaurs, again, that human for scale, that looks much more like a cedar tree. And so this seems to be referring to, in Job chapter 40, behemoth seems to be a description of some sort of Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, one of these large, four-legged, long-tailed, long-necked dinosaurs. Job 41 talks about another creature, Leviathan. Again, this is not a mythological creature. It's not a crocodile, because you look at the description. Out of his mouth go burning lights. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke goes out of his nostrils, as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth. Fire-breathing, well, see, that's all. That fire-breathing stuff is the stuff of dragons and mythology. That's not really true. Well, it's definitely not a dinosaur. Definitely not a crocodile, because it doesn't breathe fire. So what is it? Is it possible that there were creatures that breathed fire? Yes. Well, how would you produce fire? Probably chemically. When you get a chance, look up the bombardier beetle. Here's a guy who has a defense structure. He's got 2 dangerous chemicals in his abdomen. They're kept separate. You bring them together, it shoots out his backside scalding hot liquid. That's a defense mechanism against predators. So there are ways perhaps to produce fire chemically that we don't see today because these guys are extinct. This might be describing something like a plesiosaur. So not a mythological creature, definitely not a crocodile, seems like a creature we don't see today. So Job walked with dinosaurs, Adam and Eve walked with dinosaurs, Noah walked with dinosaurs. So where did they go? Well, pick up the text where we left off. Back to the flood. Noah and the ark and his family landed on the mountains of Ararat, Genesis 8:4. That seems to be somewhere near the Middle East. Now we know what happened to the people. They were told to spread out, populate the earth. They didn't. Instead, they decided to get together and build a tower whose top reaches to heaven. This displeased God, and so he forced them to separate by confusing their languages. Hard to build a tower with someone you can't speak to. Genesis 11:9, therefore God called the name of the tower Babel, the area Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. We talked about how the different ethnic groups could form easily from 2 or 8 people. Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives, genetically. Well, this was probably the event that forced the ethnic groups to form. So you've got families that can speak to one another, but to no one else, they're going to go off this way. And with them, they're going to take certain genetic sequences. And so over time, certain elements are going to be lost, certain ones are going to stay just due to random chance, or in genetic terms, genetic drift. These guys are going to go this way, so their inbreeding population is going to acquire certain characteristics, and on you go. And you get the different ethnic groups as people spread out. Now, what did the earth look like when they spread out? You'll notice probably if you've looked at a globe at any length of time, my apologies, that's really dim. It's supposed to be one landmass. You can see how South America seems to kind of fit into Africa, as if they were once attached. And Scripture seems to imply in Genesis 1, when God lifts up the dry land out of the oceans, day 3, that perhaps there was one landmass. And if the continents split, probably happened during the flood, when destruction would have been minimal. And there are other reasons why, based on the layers that we see in the Earth's surface. So when the ark landed, it probably landed on a continent that looked very similar to what we see today. So the ark lands in Ararat, probably somewhere near the Middle East. Humans disembark. Instead of spreading out over the earth, they said, let's build a tower in the plains of Shinar. And God confused the languages, forces them to spread out, so they spread out over the earth. Now what about the animals? Dinosaurs would have left the ark, disembarked. It seems the animals obeyed the command to go out and fill the earth. But how in the world would they have gone from here to some of the farthest reaches, like Australia or think South America? How do you get dinosaurs all the way over to Peru? Well, what do you notice that's different about this map? Lots of ice. So ice is frozen water. That's got to come from somewhere. So the Bible talks about the fountains of the great deep ripping open. That's the start of the flood. This may have involved lots of volcanic activity. Volcanoes are hot. It's likely that the oceans were hot post-flood. That would increase evaporation. It would have effects on the climate. And to summarize a lot of physics, this would likely produce an ice age immediately post-flood. Ice age stopped because the oceans have cooled since then, and the ice melted. But as ice goes from oceans into the atmosphere and then precipitates on land, what's going to happen to the ocean levels? They're going to drop. And so land that's currently underwater would be exposed, including land probably between what's now Russia and Alaska. Also land between Southeast Asia and Australia. My apologies, that's rather dim, but it's supposed to show you somehow how basically Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, they're all connected down here because of the lower levels due to an ice age. So how would the dinosaurs, other creatures, have gotten to North and South America? They may very well have simply walked on these land bridges that existed back then. They've also floated over. There's probably lots of plant debris. Why do I say that? Mount St. Helens just stripped all sorts of plant material in front of it, dumped it in Spirit Lake. Those logs are still floating. And there are strong ocean currents that could theoretically bring these creatures to distant places. Okay, so they spread out. Job saw them. Other people probably saw them. You do have, in cultures around the world, talk of dragons. These are probably not mythological creatures, but something like dinosaurs. But we're still stuck with the question, what happened to them? Why don't we see them today? There are some reports that they exist. The BBC sent a team down to the middle of Africa some time ago because there were enough reports from the natives of some dinosaur-like creature that they wanted to investigate. So this isn't some creationist fantasy. Even the secularists are interested in this question. Well, let's leave the dinosaurs for a moment and talk about mammals. I brought up this point yesterday. So if the biblical term kind is approximately equal to the level of family, you can measure the number of mammal kinds by the number of mammal families. Well, when you look in the fossil record, for all the families of mammals that have ever existed, 70% of mammal families are extinct. And that's a little disturbing. So those indricotheres, largest land mammals that ever existed, gigantic creatures, woolly mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, these guys all part of, well, this guy I think is part of a family that's still extant. Living rhinos would be living representatives of that rhino family. These guys are sometimes classified, I think, as part of the elephant family, sometimes a separate family. These guys are entirely different. But there are all sorts of strange creatures in the fossil record. We see nothing of the sort today. So how do we explain it? Well, here's where I think we might have some insights. The rate of extinctions in mammals has been tracked over the last about 200, 300 years. And of course, there's been heavy interest in the extinction, EPA, that sort of thing, in the last several decades. Well, the rate of mammal extinction, of course, the evolutionists are saying has been very high in the last 200 years. Here's a plot of the points, how many mammal species have existed on the planet over the last 200 years or so. So today, there are about 5,506 mammal species alive, right here. Now, this axis represents how many years post-flood. So this is when the flood happened. We're about 4,000 years post-flood. So we're 2014, 2,000 years back to Christ, 300 years between Abraham and Noah, and about 2,000 years between Abraham and Christ. So it's about 2,300, 4,000 years, 2,300 between Noah and Christ, 2,000 Christ till now. It's about 4,000, 4,300 years. So that's what this axis means. We're looking at 2014 on back to about 1,700. And so a few mammals have gone extinct over the past couple hundred years. Well, if you add up the number of mammal species in the fossil record, the total number of mammals that have ever existed is probably about 15,000. Again, about 70-80% of mammal species have gone extinct. So presumably all these guys existed post-flood. There's reasons for that I won't get into. And now we see this many. Well, we can use math to figure out what the rate of extinction was over time. Now I'm going to assume, just to make the math simple, that the rate of change has been constant. That's an evolutionary assumption, but it gives us a starting point. We're just not stuck on it. What if these guys went extinct at a linear rate? Just this, very straight line over time. This value right here gives you this is an R-squared value, it's a statistical value. It tells you how well this line matches the data. If the value is 1, it matches perfectly. If it's 0.2, it matches really bad. So 0.8, it's decent, but you notice it doesn't even hit that point up here. It kind of cuts right through the data there. You draw a different curve. This is, I think, a power and exponential one. Gives you a little bit better value, but again, it's missing up there, it's missing right there. There's a more complicated math curve that, wow, that's really close to 1, fits even better. There's a logarithmic curve that fits the best. These two, there's no difference between them. This, I think, may be an insight into the answer. So this curve says there were 15,000 species post-flood, and a whole bunch of them went extinct in the 200 years immediately following the flood, and it's been rather slow ever since then. By the way, practical implication, the rate of mammal extinctions today, much less apparently than what it once was, so there's no reason for hysteria. So once again, your view on origins affects how you view things today. Your view on the Ice Age affects whether or not we should be caring about global warming today. If you believe in an Ice Age immediately post-flood, well, the climate's changed a whole lot more than what we see today, so why are we getting hysterical? Why are we getting hysterical about mammal extinctions today? Should we conserve resources? Yes. Should we go crazy? No, because it's been a lot worse in times past. Well, Scripture tells us one of the other changes that happened post-flood was this. So in Genesis 1, God commands creatures to eat plants. Genesis 3, God says to mankind, "Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as the green herbs." So Noah and his family were godly. It doesn't take long after the flood for people to be ungodly and to not care about conservation or any of those sorts of things. So immediately following the flood, God says, "Kill and eat." Now, what's the chance that something's going to go extinct immediately post-flood if you start killing it? Pretty high, because there are very few individuals. It's a little bit harder to make walruses go extinct today because there are a lot of them. Elephants, there aren't as many. They've been poached a lot. But how do you make zebras go extinct? Well, there's thousands, hundreds of thousands, probably of individuals roaming the plains of Africa. Immediately post-flood, there may have been 10. So you kill off 10, boom, they're gone. Never to be seen again. So this is essentially a probability argument. Why do species go extinct? They probably went extinct most rapidly, that's my guess at this point, immediately post-flood, because that was the best chance to make them go extinct. And immediately post-flood, God said, you're free to kill and eat those things that are alive instead of subsisting strictly on plants. So this is all an argument based on mammals. My guess is the same thing holds true for reptiles and other creatures. The chance of going extinct when your numbers are low is high. Once they spread out, fill the earth, reproduce a lot, the chance of going extinct dramatically reduces. Now, as we've colonized the globe more extensively, it becomes more easy then to make creatures go extinct, which is why they're still going extinct. So that's my guess. The dinosaur history does affect how we understand when they go extinct, but it's the biblical history, not the evolutionary one. So, just to summarize, when did these guys live? Same time with man, which again strikes right at the heart of the popular ideas of when dinosaurs lived. They think you're a flat earther if you think these guys roamed the earth with mankind. It just seems ridiculous. Also seems ridiculous to folks that they began with plant eating, not with meat eating. But that's a misunderstanding of biblical history. Death doesn't begin until after sin. Their fossils, of course, formed during the flood, and this is, even if you didn't have the scripture, what you should conclude from the fossil record, because it's basically a record of aquatic creatures. What happened to these guys? Perhaps they were killed off. There may be some alive today, but people may have killed them off, and there's an explanation you will never hear from the secularists, because supposedly these creatures and man were separated by about 60 million years. Do we still have a bookstore? We don't have a bookstore. So if you go to our website, you can get some resources on dinosaurs. We have a DVD, a talk on dinosaurs by our science writer, Brian Thomas, books for kids on dinosaurs, fantastic. This is sort of our one-stop resource on creation basics and beyond, on creation A to Z, a version for kids. This is the best geology book around as far as I'm concerned. Jason Lyle, I mentioned earlier about the starlight and time issue. He's got a lecture on astronomy that includes that. A book on animals for kids, other books we didn't bring with. And forget dishing out cash, just sign up for Acts and Facts. You'll keep up to speed the best way that way. And if you just spend some time on our website, there it is, icr.org, you'll be well served, I think, with some effort. 40 years worth of articles on this creation evolution issue. My time is up. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here this weekend. I've thoroughly enjoyed my time. You've been a great crowd. And if you have any questions, I do have a Facebook page. I turned this off. Public Facebook page. You can email the website as well. It's a little bit slower. If you send me a message or just post something on my wall here, hopefully I can give you a quicker answer, point you in the right direction. Thank you again.